Imagine constructing a network of contacts so powerful that even 2,000 years later, it would still be influencing billions of people around the world. No LinkedIn, no Instagram, no WhatsApp. It seems impossible, doesn't it? But that is exactly what one man named Paul managed to do in the first century of the Christian era. Have you ever wondered how a single man managed to spread a message throughout the known world in a time without the internet? How did he convert everyone, from slaves to members of Caesar's household? How did he maintain deep relationships over long distances when a letter could take months to reach its destination? The Apostle Paul created the greatest network of contacts in the ancient world without any social media. And the most impressive part, he transformed his greatest enemies into his most loyal allies. Stay until the end of this video to discover how Paul used a surprising method to turn even his imprisonments into opportunities to expand his influence, something that no digital marketing expert is telling you today. When we talk about networking in the modern world, we immediately think of business cards, professional conferences, optimized LinkedIn profiles, and techniques to impress influential people. Marketing gurus sell the idea that we need to appear perfect, hide our weaknesses, and maintain an impeccable image in order to build a powerful network. But Paul of Tarsus, the apostle whose letters make up a large portion of the New Testament, used radically different principles. And the results speak for themselves. In just a few decades, he established Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean and created a network of relationships that survived persecutions, enormous geographic distances, and deep cultural differences. Throughout this video, we will discover how Paul initiated strategic relationships with people from diverse backgrounds, how he overcame seemingly insurmountable cultural barriers, and, even more surprisingly, how he kept his network active and engaged with nothing more than parchment and ink. And most importantly, we will see how we can apply these same principles today in a world where connections seem increasingly superficial and self-interested. To understand Paul's brilliance in building relationships, we must go back to the beginning of his story. Before he became the great apostle to the Gentiles, he was Saul of Tarsus, a young Pharisee, educated under the great teacher Gamaliel, one of Israel's greatest masters. He was no ordinary person. He belonged to the intellectual and religious elite, was born a Roman citizen, a rare privilege, and had powerful connections in the Sanhedrin. When Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, he not only changed his beliefs, he completely transformed his network of relationships. From a persecutor of Christians, he became one of them. Suddenly, his old connections became threats, and those he had once persecuted became his new brothers. And here comes Paul's first great networking principle. Start where you are and use what you have. Paul did not discard his previous skills or background. He used his deep knowledge of the law and the prophets to connect with Jews in the synagogues. He leveraged his Roman citizenship to access privileged spaces and to defend himself when necessary. He capitalized on his Hellenistic education to communicate effectively with both Greeks and Romans. Compare this to what marketing gurus teach today. They would say, reinvent yourself completely. Abandon your past. Create a new persona to impress. Paul did exactly the opposite. He integrated his past, with all its complexities, into his new mission. In Paul's letters, we see how he built bridges between completely different worlds. When he writes to the Romans, he demonstrates knowledge of their culture and imperial laws. When he speaks to the Jews, he cites the scriptures with authority. When addressing the Greeks, as he did in Athens, he even quotes local poets. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Acts 17:28. Paul did not try to be a different person for each group. Instead, he found authentic points of connection based on a genuine interest in the cultural background of his interlocutors. This approach stands in stark contrast to the superficial networking we see today, where people completely change their behavior depending on whom they are trying to impress. Paul remained true to himself, yet he found genuine common ground with each person and culture. A fascinating example of this strategy is found in his letter to the Romans. Paul had never been to Rome when he wrote the letter, yet in chapter 16, he sends greetings by name to over 26 people. How did he know so many individuals in a city he had never visited? Paul had built such a solid network through his travels that he knew people connected to Rome in various other cities. He had carefully mapped these connections and used them strategically. Today, we call this second-degree networking, knowing people through mutual connections. Paul mastered this art long before social networks existed. If you are enjoying this content about how Paul built his network authentically and effectively, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're launching a complete series on how biblical characters can teach us practical principles for modern life. And I want to ask you a question. How are you building your network today? Are you trying to appear as someone you're not? Or are you using your unique experiences to create authentic connections? Share in the comments how you have applied or could apply this first principle of Paul in your daily life. The second revolutionary networking principle we learned from Paul is something that seems contradictory to current standards: authentic vulnerability as a tool for connection. In personal branding and networking courses, what do we hear the most? Show only your successes. Hide your weaknesses. Project an image of perfection and constant success. Paul did exactly the opposite. In his letters, Paul shows himself to be surprisingly vulnerable. He openly shares his challenges, weaknesses, and even failures. In his second letter to the Corinthians, for example, he writes about his thorn in the flesh, a persistent difficulty that troubled him. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." 2 Corinthians 12, 8-9. Paul not only admits his weakness, but he even says he takes pride in it. This goes against everything modern personal marketing teaches. In another passage, he describes how he felt inadequate and fearful when he first visited the Corinthians. "I came to you with weakness, fear, and much trembling. My message and my preaching did not rely on persuasive words of wisdom, but on a demonstration of the power of the Spirit." 1 Corinthians 2, 3-4. Paul did not try to appear as an infallible super apostle. He showed his human side, with real fears and insecurities. And the result of this vulnerability was not rejection or a loss of authority, as many might fear today. On the contrary, it strengthened his bonds with the communities. Paul's relationship with the church in Corinth is a fascinating case study. This was a troubled congregation, marked by divisions, immorality, and challenges to Paul's authority. Instead of adopting a purely authoritarian stance, Paul alternated between firmness and vulnerability. He expressed his hurt when he felt betrayed, confessed his deep love for them, and opened up about his own struggles. This approach created a type of connection that transcended the professional and touched the personal. People did not follow Paul merely for his credentials or abilities, but because they felt an authentic human connection with him. Think about how this applies today. How many professional connections remain superficial because both parties are stuck behind a facade of perfection? How many opportunities for genuine connection are lost because we are afraid to show who we really are? The lesson Paul teaches us is that authentic vulnerability, not manipulative self-disclosure, but genuine openness, creates deeper and more lasting bonds. People are more likely to trust someone who has the courage to show their imperfections. In a world where everyone is trying to appear perfect on social media, Paul's authenticity would be his greatest differentiator. Recapping what we have seen so far, Paul first teaches us to use our unique experiences and cultural background to create authentic connections. And second, to not be afraid to show genuine vulnerability, which creates deeper bonds than a facade of perfection ever could. But what happens when we face great adversity? How do we react when life seems to conspire against us and our networking ambitions? Many of us retreat and isolate ourselves when we encounter difficulties. Here's where Paul's third principle becomes especially revolutionary. Keep watching to discover how Paul transformed his greatest adversities, including imprisonments and persecutions, into the most powerful opportunities to expand his network of influence. The third networking principle Paul teaches us is truly counterintuitive, turning adversities into opportunities for connection. When Paul was imprisoned, an occurrence that happened several times during his ministry, he did not see it as the end of his ability to influence and connect. Instead, he transformed his imprisonment into platforms for new connections and for expanding his message. In his letter to the Philippians, written during a period of incarceration, Paul reveals something surprising. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear to all the palace guards and to everyone else that I am in prison for Christ. Philippians 1:12-13. Paul turned his imprisonment into an opportunity to connect with the Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers who served directly under the emperor. People whom he would never have had access to under normal circumstances were now in daily contact with him. Later in the same letter, he mentions, "All the saints send their greetings, especially those of Caesar's household." Philippians 4:22. This is extraordinary. Paul, a prisoner, managed to establish connections within the very heart of the Roman imperial household. In modern terms, it would be like someone in detention managing to network with direct advisors to the president or state ministers. This strategy completely contradicts what modern marketing gurus teach today. The contemporary message is, hide your failures and difficulties. Only show up when you have something positive to display. Paul did exactly the opposite. He not only did not hide his difficulties, but he used them as a platform for new connections. During another imprisonment in Caesarea, Paul had the opportunity to speak before Governor Felix, King Agrippa, and his wife Berenice, the political elite of the Roman province. Even while in chains, he seized the chance to establish a personal connection with these authorities, to the point where King Agrippa remarked, "For a little while you almost persuaded me to become a Christian." Acts 26:28. In modern language, Paul understood something crucial. Adversities create unique opportunities for authenticity and differentiation. When everyone is trying to project perfection, the one who faces challenges openly and with dignity stands out. This principle applies powerfully today. Think about how we react when we lose a job, face a professional setback, or go through a personal crisis. Our tendency is to withdraw, vanish from social networks, and avoid professional contacts until things get better. Paul challenges us to do the opposite, to use moments of vulnerability to deepen our connections, not in a manipulative or self-pitying way, but with dignity and purpose. An executive who openly shares the lessons learned from a failed project. An entrepreneur who speaks honestly about the difficulties of their journey. A professional who admits to being in a career transition and asks for guidance. These people, following Paul's example, often discover that adversities open doors to connections far more meaningful than apparent success ever could. As Paul demonstrated, our scars and challenges are not impediments to powerful connections. Often, they're exactly what make them possible. At this moment, I invite you to reflect honestly. How have you been handling your difficult times? Do you hide them, hoping that no one notices? Or do you have the courage, like Paul, to turn them into opportunities for authentic connection? Perhaps you're facing a challenge right now, a layoff, a failed business venture, a health or family problem. And if, instead of isolating yourself, you followed Paul's example and used this experience to strengthen and deepen your connections? If you're intrigued by this countercultural approach to networking inspired by Paul, be sure to check out our other videos about biblical characters and their surprisingly relevant lessons for today. We have content on how David faced giants at work, how Joseph prospered in times of crisis, and how Esther broke the glass ceiling of her time. The link is in the description. The fourth and final networking principle that Paul teaches us is perhaps the most contrasting with modern practices: genuine investment in people beyond immediate self-interest. In today's relationship marketing, much is said about perceived value and strategic exchanges. The implicit question in many professional interactions is, what can I gain from this person? Paul operated with a completely different logic. One of the most touching aspects of Paul's letters is the numerous personal mentions and specific greetings. In chapter 16 of his letter to the Romans, for example, Paul names more than 26 people, often adding personal comments about each one. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. I am grateful to them. Greet Mary, who worked tirelessly for you. Greet Andronicus and Eunia, my relatives who were with me in prison. They are notable among the apostles and were in Christ before me, and so on, with personal details about each individual. This reveals something profound about Paul's approach. He did not see people as mere contacts or resources, but as unique individuals with their own stories, contributions, and intrinsic value. Consider the contrast with modern transactional networking, where we often treat professional connections as entries in a database. Paul invested time and attention to truly get to know the people in his network. Paul's relationship with his closest collaborators, such as Timothy and Titus, demonstrates another aspect of this principle. Paul not only trained them for specific tasks, but invested in their overall development. In his first letter to Timothy, we see him advising Timothy on matters of health, take a little wine for your stomach, on handling people of different ages, on developing leadership, and on strengthening his personal faith. This level of investment goes far beyond immediate self-interest. Paul was building people, not merely exploiting their talents. The lesson for us is clear. Truly effective networking is not about collecting contacts, but about building relationships. It is not about extracting value, but about adding genuine value to people's lives. A simple test to apply this principle. Think about the people in your professional network. How many of them would you continue to help even if you knew they could never repay the favor? How many would you support even if they moved to a completely different industry than yours? Paul invested in people for their inherent worth, not for what they could do for him. And paradoxically, this selfless approach generated a network of loyalty and support unparalleled in history. When Paul was in need, entire communities mobilized to help him. When he needed defense, people risked their reputations for him. When he was imprisoned, he received constant support from those he had genuinely invested in. In a world of increasingly transactional networking, Paul's approach reminds us that the most valuable connections are not those that bring immediate benefits, but those that are based on genuine interest and investment in the development of the other. Throughout this video, we have discovered 4 revolutionary networking principles that Paul applied 2 millennia ago and that remain more relevant than ever. First, start where you are and use what you have. Paul did not try to be someone he was not. He used his education, knowledge, and past experiences to create authentic bridges with different groups. Second, practice authentic vulnerability. Instead of projecting an image of perfection, Paul openly shared his struggles and weaknesses, creating deeper and more meaningful connections. Third, transform adversities into opportunities for connection. Paul used even his periods of imprisonment to reach people he would never have otherwise met, including members of the Imperial Guard and Caesar's household. And fourth, invest genuinely in people beyond immediate self-interest. Paul demonstrated personal knowledge and sincere concern for every individual in his network, building deep relationships rather than superficial contacts. These principles stand in stark contrast to modern networking tactics, which often prioritize quantity over quality, image over authenticity, and self-interest over genuine investment. The irony is that while digital marketing gurus sell us formulas to build networks of thousands of superficial followers, Paul, with nothing more than parchment and ink, built a network so powerful that 2 millennia later, it still impacts billions of people around the globe. In a world where human connections seem increasingly superficial and self-interested, perhaps it is time to rediscover Paul's countercultural approach. Authenticity instead of image, vulnerability instead of artificial perfection, resilience in the face of adversities, and genuine investment in people for who they are, not for what they can offer us. Imagine how different our professional and personal connections would be if we applied these principles. Imagine the impact we could have if, like Paul, we saw each person not as a contact to be exploited, but as a unique individual with whom we can build a meaningful connection. At the beginning of this video, we asked how Paul managed to spread his message throughout the known world without modern technology. The answer is that he understood something many of us have forgotten. In the end, networking is not about techniques or platforms, but about people. And people respond to authenticity, vulnerability, resilience, and genuine investment today, just as they did 2,000 years ago. And you, which of these principles of Paul challenged you the most? Which one do you plan to apply first in your personal or professional life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue this conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that connects biblical wisdom with contemporary challenges. Until the next video,